The theatre of mind can perform many shows, and the show by which we are most intimately acquainted with is our primate one, this human interface which presents us with an outer world of 3D objects and an inner world of thoughts, feelings, and emotions. This interface, this experience, is nature's fundamental given. It mediates our entire acquaintance with the world. Everything you touch, see, and feel, your sense of having a body, this extended world which surrounds and situates you, this is all there has been, and will ever be, at least for your monkey's lifespan. And what these things all are mental phenomena, experiences which are directly felt within a space we call the present moment. And all we really know for certain is this direct experience of being, the here and nowness of life. Everything else is an abstraction, an extrapolated leap into the unknown. Even our ties to the past or the future are these faint images that we construct in the present. Somehow, via some mechanism which is hidden from our awareness, reality is made comprehensible. The world does not present itself as a big, bumbling confusion, but rather a structured and sensible domain. We intuitively pass a scene into separate objects with colours, shapes, and different actions afforded by them. How exactly we do this is, well, it seems to be beyond the purview of our monkey brains. We were, well, merely thrust into this sort of human VR headset with little to say regarding its design principles, and as such there is really a radical mystery to it all. What the hell is going on anyways? It does seem that this first-person reality that we are witness to has been moulded according to the constraints of Darwinian selection and the idiosyncrasies of our primate evolutionary heritage. And, we can ask, would this evolved perceptual apparatus, would it grant us a window into quote-unquote reality, or can it only really be expected to provide a species-specific user interface, a primate Windows 95 or some sort, with a set of useful and extremely adaptive, but ultimately illusory icons and dials for coordinating behavior? For instance, is what we call space and time not something outside of us, but rather the intrinsic form of how we render reality? Our human perspective simply presents us with a space-time world, and being entrenched permanently within this headset of sorts, it's difficult to conceive of anything outside of space and time. But what if, one could have direct experience of the ineffable, of something that one could perhaps describe as being non-spatial or non-temporal? Some may say that the use of psychedelic compounds, which are these sort of they provide these direct confrontations with the mystery. These non-spatial or temporal states are perhaps extremely accessible. You just need the will and the courage to, well, embrace the cosmic strangeness that accompanies such states. When psychedelic compounds are consumed and the contents of consciousness radically transformed, what windows, what portals are these things providing? Psychedelics, they often instantiate in the user a felt sense that one is peering deeper into what's real, that they are in some way or another now acquainted with an increasingly unblemished lens into reality. Aldous Huxley famously used a reducing valve analogy to explain what is occurring experientially during a psychedelic trip. In this analogy, waking consciousness can be understood as a filtration of a broader and dispersed mind at large. And what psychedelics do, they make permeable They make leaky this boundary that exists between us and everything, us and the world. The reducing valve is turned down, as it were, you know, undermining the brain's filtration, allowing a new and expansive wave of psychic contents to penetrate one's experience. And this wave of consciousness is experienced as an expansion of sensation, as an enhancement of the resolution of one's sensory environment. First time psychedelic users who manage to summon the moral courage to venture into this domain should really expect to explore a novel dimension to their conscious experience. The screen of perception can, as it were, play many different movies with many different forms, and it's very easy and quite natural to become utterly overwhelmed by the unimaginable engulfing your visual field. This is especially pertinent to fast-acting psychedelics like DMT or dimethyltryptamine, which, when smoked or vaporized, can produce the experience of what could perhaps best be described as a flash, which transforms one's immediate surroundings into a far stranger and complex realm. Your perceptual morphology in waking, sober consciousness, it usually converges upon a stable three-dimensional structure. Yet within seconds of consuming a compound like DMT, there is this disintegration of the 3D reality that we are often habituated to. The lines and borders in our world which delineate discrete objects and things, these dynamics which seemingly segment our perceptual scene into something that we can comfortably label with language. These dynamics, they become exponentially fuzzy. It gives way to formlessness, and your visual scene really becomes this exploration of these hyperbolic fractal forms, if I'm going to attach any words to it. The mundane reality of the dingy room you were just in moments before sharing with your audible friends becomes a distant memory when you now appear to be thrust into an utterly incomprehensible and, well, mystical dimension of experience, often populated with seemingly autonomous entities when one consumes a sufficient breakthrough dose. Of course, there is great variance in how this expansion of consciousness manifests across the vast array of known psychedelic compounds, but commonalities often include visual, auditory, and psychological changes, and also, of course, a radically altered state of consciousness. The most popular classical psychedelics, which you're likely aware of, are the LSDs, the psilocybins, mescalins, and DMTs, and these compounds currently dominate most of the scientific research that is currently being undergone on these substances. In the therapeutic context, psychedelics can be a profound catalyst for personal insight, for defabricating maladaptive frames and negative thinking patterns. They also lead, in some cases, to positive personality transformation, increasing feelings of openness and spiritual mysticism. In my own case, whilst I have certainly benefited from these therapeutic effects, my use of these compounds tends to center upon really an exploration of consciousness for its own sake. For as long as I've been alive, really, I've been permanently boggled by the the mystery of being, this cosmic itch of, why there is something happening at all. And this itch, it can never really be fully scratched. What psychedelics seem to do really is they confront you directly with the mystery of what the hell is going on, of how approximate and incomplete all our models of reality are. As Terence McKenna once put it, reality is far stranger than even you can suppose. And even our current models of physics, with observable reality being the quantum fluctuations of these fields of nothingness, or the excitations of these hyperdimensional strings, these are all very odd ideas. I mean, from first principles, it does seem as though experience is structured with an outer visual scene coupled with an inner interoceptive sense, a sense of occupying a body, avatar, and mind animated with a spontaneity of private thoughts, feelings, and sensations. This really seems to be the experiential framework that structures more or less every engagement one has with what's real. There is an inner sense of what is me and an outer sense of what is not me. Though, of course, like the yin and the yang, the concept of an inner is mutually dependent on the existence of an outer, and this mutual dependence suggests that the exact distinction between these two things, the binary between what is me and not me in nature, is a surprisingly fuzzy and elusive boundary to discover. In fact, it's my opinion that there is no such boundary. We are not these discrete, separate entities, but rather utterly continuous with nature and the cosmos. I think this really necessarily follows from the notion of quantum non-locality in physics. Interconnectedness with everything isn't some spiritual woo-woo, but rather just the state of things, as far as I can tell. What the psychedelic experience does, in essence, is it grants a direct path to this experience of interconnection with the cosmos. This primarily lies, I believe, in the boundary dissolving effect that psychedelics produce. In a dose-dependent manner, they make more permeable the illusory boundary between the subject and the object, such that there is felt this sinking into a more primordial and instinctive and flowing kind of experience. This sinking, from the perspective of the linguistic ego, can be interpreted as a loss of control, as a kind of death that must be resisted. And when one is so habituated to an egoic frame of apprehending things, which for many in our consumerist and credential driven culture is an unfortunate reality, it is difficult not to interpret this dissolving as a kind of death, as opposed to a radical expansion of one's consciousness. Now, I'd like to say that many of us have in fact experienced states analogous to the kind of ego dissolution that accompanies a psychedelic trip. We merely haven't labelled them as such. For instance, many of us have felt the sense of being quote unquote lost in a movie. During such states, there is this hypnotic like immersion in the contents of the screen, and we seem to lose a kind of secondary awareness of the screen that we are watching the movie on, whatever sensations happen to be percolating in our bodies, anxieties that have been taking hold earlier that day. The sense of losing oneself tends to be a characteristic element of these flow-like experiences, and we seem to be able to enter them not just when watching movies, but when doing a vast swath of activities, sports, work, music. There are, well, many diverse paths to this intrinsically desirable state of consciousness. In this state, this flow-like state, we are less caught up in our neurotic ruminations. Rather, there is this sort of seeming surrender to the subtle whims and flows of the present moment. I mean, one of the central benefits of meditative practice and activity which habituates an instinctive tether to the present moment is that it makes the transition into these flow states of egoless experience much more frictionless and also more recognizable. By detecting the ways in which one is sort of constantly distracted in experience, you start to recognize these prolonged periods of effortless concentration, perhaps analogous to the Taoist notion of wu wei, effortless action. As eventually, with enough practice, the flow state seems to define the meditator's habitual mode of being. I mean, meditation is a whole different thing. I probably will release an episode on that by itself because it's an extremely interesting and, well, important, I suppose, aspect of what it's like to be a conscious entity. I mean, okay, now to bring it back to psychedelics, what they seem to do is they dissolve and deconstruct the boundaries that structure our perception of reality. In some sense, you could say that these substances, they toggle with the dials that our mind uses to disambiguate and render experience. As such, they have the profound ability to reveal to the user experiential states far outside the normality of waking consciousness. These states can be hyperbolic in nature, revealing hyperdimensional, geometric, fractal structures, plethoras of indescribable and unseen colours. Really, they open the doors of creativity, revealing a rich and vibrant inner world of artistic creation, a sort of portal into an experiential aesthetic, which is utterly unfathomable to those who are uninitiated. I mean, the fact that within each of us we have the capacity to imaginatively render something so beautiful and yet so alien with the aid of a psychedelic should give pause really to the perennial question of, well, who are we exactly? A defining feature of many of these effects is their ineffability. They are so far outside the confines of our conceptualizing mind that mere words fail spectacularly to reveal what is directly experienced. Language, as a mediator, can only point to these effects. It can never replace or express in a satisfying way what is directly felt when undergoing such a profound transformation. There is really a remarkable spectrum to the psychedelic experience, with many different compounds having diverse and varied effects on consciousness, some varying in length. DMT can last as little as 10 to 15 minutes when smoked, producing what, like I said, could best be described as a reality-shattering flash, which transports oneself into a seemingly transcendental reality populated with entities Terence McKenna has described as self-transforming machine elves. Other compounds like LSD, they can take you on a ride for 8 to 12 hours, giving you more time to orient yourselves within this novel mode of representing the world. Delirium substances like salvia, for example, target perhaps some mechanisms by which pure cognitive coherence is established. I mean, I've not personally tried this substance, but from reports I've read, it is often regarded as one of the most confusing and reality warping compounds available in nature. People often report feeling as though they are material objects like a stack of cards or a ticking clock. I mean, perhaps what these drugs do, they distort the mechanism by which subject objectuality is established. I can look at a tree, but I feel as though I am not literally the tree, even though it is an object appearing in my experience. I mean, this feeling of being somehow separate from one's experience as a self is a perception that does bleed throughout waking consciousness, but as such substances show, they are not an essential aspect of experience. Now, psychedelics can be largely split into three families of chemical compounds: tryptamines, phenethylamines, and lysergamides. If I pronounce that right, I do not know. In the brain, it's thought that their effects are largely mediated through serotonin receptor 2A agonism. We have the serotonin receptors distributed throughout the brain, concentrating in varying amounts of different structures, and when a psychedelic compound is consumed, its molecules bind to one of these serotonin 5-HT2A receptors, causing an excitation since it is an agonist rather than an antagonist. You can think that what these psychedelics do is they look very similar chemically to serotonin, and such can, well, pretend to be serotonin and trigger these receptors. And following from ingestion of a psychedelic, we see a modulation of neural activity across the brain, which seems to be correlating with the alterations in sensation and cognition that accompany the psychedelic state. Now, it's important to note that we really barely understand the brain and its relationship to experience. Thus, whilst we see the involvement of a particular subtype of serotonin receptor and various systematic changes in neural function, understanding why these neural changes should lead to significant perceptual and experiential changes is, well, largely a mystery. Activity reductions in what neuroscientists have labeled the default mode network often tend to be reported in psychedelic neural imaging studies. Now, this network has been broadly correlated with self-referential cognition, which is thinking about myself, about the past, about what I'm going to do next. To take a Freudian lens, you could say that these are the neural correlates of the ego, the part of you that is forever assessing oneself, negotiating between the more appetitive and moralistic elements of the psyche. Decreases in the activity of this cluster of networks map somewhat onto the phenomena of ego dissolution, a central aspect of the psychedelic experience. Now, this cessation of thinking about thinking, this reporting of experience, which often claims a neurotic grip upon our well-being, it seems to be a central element of the ego death/dissolution phenomena. In a sense, you cease the capacity to conceptualize, forcing oneself into a pure and instinctive mode of being. If one thing does remain constant, though, amongst all the perceptual changes that accompany a trip, is the sense of being a raw witness to all the transformations. The observer doesn't seem to disappear, but what is being observed can undergo a massive complexification. One's breathing as well also typically follows you on your exploration into these altered states, and so I think can be relied upon to provide a kind of tether to experience. I mean, breathing techniques in general are an extremely effective and underrated tool for modulating one's nervous system for both alertness and relaxation. I think the stigmatized nature of these compounds within Western culture has led really to a dearth of voluntary initiates, of people with the bravery to step into the unknown, to flirt with the mystery. And for the first time, or even regular psychonauts, as they're often called, people who explore consciousness through these altered states, it is common to see a real fear of losing control. And as the substance takes effect, this fear can metamorphise into a real existential paranoia. And damn, you really went too far this time. And it can be quite a shift to have the boundaries of cognition melt away before you. And indeed, it's this boundary dissolving effect that perhaps make these substances so disconcerting for the maintenance of specific cultural systems and power structures. We should obviously ask the question, why are these things so stigmatized anyways? Why are they bad for consumption in so many societies today? Is this the benevolent safeguarding of a nurturing state, or something more pernicious? Considering that the classical psychedelics, the LSD, psilocybins, DMTs, or even cannabis for that matter, are practically impossible to overdose on, and are perhaps some of the safest physiological drugs available, should give real pause to, well, how trustworthy such authority figures are when they're speaking about these substances. Unfortunately, there is such a warped public perception of these things because of the hangover from the war on drugs, which in reality is a war on people. Crucially, this is not a war on all drugs: alcohol, tobacco, coffee, prescription opioids, they're fine. But typically, it is a war on the drugs that are historically associated with ethnic minorities and oppressed groups. Harry Anslinger, for instance, an early pioneer of the drug war, famously favoured using the Mexican Spanish word marijuana rather than cannabis in order to associate the drug with Mexican immigrant communities. And, well, demonizing drugs can become a very effective proxy for demonizing particular sections of the population. The American crack cocaine hysteria, for example, in the 80s and the 90s, provided a real political impetus for excessively over-policing majority black communities. For some reason, this hysteria led to crack cocaine being seen as this extremely dangerous compound, some orders of magnitude above powder cocaine, which unsurprisingly tend to be consumed by richer folk. And, well, this perspective is just, utterly wrong. They are both chemically equivalent drugs, just different routes of administration. The fact that crack is somehow more stigmatized than coke is not based upon critical thinking about the relative harms of these compounds, but merely the hangover of, well, racist drug messaging. Now, this fact that, well, the war on drugs still persists, even into 2023, and I am still unable to legally access plants like cannabis, plants which are absurdly benign for your body, and yet I can chain smoke 20 cigarettes or down 5 pints of this toxin which makes me feel funky for a bit. You know, perhaps, maybe, the root of our societal dysfunction, this alienated postmodern world we inhabit, lies in what states of consciousness we approve and disapprove of. It's interesting to think about how would society change if we dismantled our alcohol and cigarette culture and opened up the realm of experience. I think this fact that many people can go their entire lives without having experienced the mystery of reality firsthand is really a castration of one's consciousness. Psychedelics, really, they should be seen as a rite of passage and essential aspect of the human experience. Without such experiences, we are spiritually amputated and existentially lost. Unfortunately, cultural forces have hidden this side of humanity during this particular time in history. However, I think and I hope that the veil is being lifted and slowly people are beginning to wake up